Picture this, you're 62, raising your granddaughter alone and your auto shop is about to close because you can't make rent. Then one rainy afternoon, you stop to help a stranded woman with car trouble, a simple act of kindness that most people would call you foolish for in today's world. Frank Sullivan believes in doing what's right even when it's inconvenient. What he doesn't know is that this stranger carries secrets that will test everything he believes about trust, family, and fighting for justice. This is a story about the values our generation was raised on, that your word means something, that family comes first, and that good people still change the world. It's about discovering that love and new purpose don't have expiration dates. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from, and if you believe we need more stories about decent people doing right, hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's story is something special. Now let's see what happens when one act of kindness changes everything. Frank thought he knew about second chances. The morning mist clung to the windows of Sullivan's auto like a familiar friend that had overstayed its welcome. Frank Sullivan wiped his hands on an oil-stained rag and squinted at the ancient cash register that had been counting pennies instead of dollars for the past 3 months. The garage smelled of motor oil coffee that had been brewing since dawn, and the faint scent of Emma's strawberry shampoo from where she'd been helping him organize bolts by size. At 62, Frank's hands told the story of 4 decades working with engines. First in the Air Force, maintaining transport planes that carried soldiers home from places with names he couldn't pronounce. Then at Boeing, where precision meant the difference between safe flights and newspaper headlines. Now in this cramped garage on the east side of Portland, those same hands coaxed life from pickup trucks and sedans whose best years were behind them. "Grandpa Frank," Emma called from her perch on an overturned crate, her 7-year-old voice cutting through the morning quiet. "Mrs. Chen's car is making that noise again." Frank looked over at his granddaughter, her dark curls escaping from the pink headband that never quite managed to contain them. She wore her school uniform navy blue jumper over a white blouse, but had insisted on putting on the miniature work apron he'd sewn for her last Christmas. In her small hands, she held a toy wrench, moving it in precise motions as she fixed the plastic engine of her toy car. "What kind of noise, Em?" he asked, though he already knew. Mrs. Chen's 1998 Honda Civic had been wheezing like an old man climbing stairs for the past month. "Like this," Emma said, making a grinding sound that was surprisingly accurate for a 7-year-old. Frank chuckled, despite the weight pressing on his chest. The weight that came from knowing the envelope on his desk contained a notice about the garage's rent increasing by 40%. The weight that came from Emma's private school tuition being due in 2 weeks. The weight that came from being the only thing standing between his granddaughter and a world that had already taken too much from her. "You're getting good at diagnosing problems, kiddo," he said, walking over to ruffle her hair. "Maybe you'll be the mechanic and I'll be your assistant." Emma giggled, the sound bright enough to push back the morning gloom. "Silly grandpa, you know more about cars than anyone in the whole world." Frank's throat tightened. Emma said things like that with such absolute faith, as if her grandfather could fix anything that was broken. If only it were that simple. The truth was, Frank Sullivan had been fixing things his entire life: engines, transmissions, relationships, hearts, but he'd never quite figured out how to fix the hole that had been left when his son David died in that accident 2 years ago. One moment, David had been dropping Emma off for their usual Saturday morning together. The next, Frank was signing papers to become Emma's legal guardian, trying to explain to a 5-year-old why Daddy wasn't coming home. Sarah, his wife of 38 years, had died of cancer when Emma was barely walking. Now it was just the two of them in the small apartment above the garage, figuring out life one day at a time. The bell above the garage door chimed, announcing their first customer of the day. Frank looked up to see Robert Martinez walking in his postal worker uniform, crisp despite the early hour. "Morning, Frank," Robert said, his voice carrying the warmth of someone who'd been a neighbor for 15 years. "Emma looking professional as always." "Morning, Mr. Martinez," Emma replied, standing up straighter and adjusting her toy tool belt. Robert's smile faltered slightly as he looked at Frank. "Listen, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but I've got to deliver this." He held out an official-looking envelope. "Certified mail from Northfield Property Management." Frank's stomach dropped. Northfield was the corporate landlord that had bought the building 6 months ago, full of promises about maintaining the character of the neighborhood and supporting local businesses. Those promises, it seemed, came with expiration dates. Thanks, Robert, Frank said, taking the envelope. His hands remained steady. 40 years of military and aviation training had taught him not to show weakness, especially in front of Emma. Robert lingered for a moment, as if he wanted to say something more. Finally, he cleared his throat. Frank, if there's anything Mary and I can do. We're fine, Frank replied, the words automatic. Just the usual paperwork, you know how it is. After Robert left, Frank set the envelope on his workbench without opening it. He already knew what it would say. The neighborhood was changing, property values were rising, and small businesses like his were being priced out to make room for trendy coffee shops and boutique fitness studios. Grandpa and Emma's voice was smaller now, uncertain. Yeah, sweetheart? Are we in trouble? Frank looked at his granddaughter, really looked at her. At 7, Emma had already developed the kind of awareness that came from losing parents too young. She noticed things other kids miss, the way adults' voices changed when they talked about money, the way her grandfather's shoulders tensed when bills arrived, the way conversations stopped when she walked into a room. Frank knelt down so he was at her eye level. Do you remember what I taught you about engines? She nodded solemnly. Sometimes they make scary noises, but that doesn't mean they're broken. Sometimes they just need the right part or the right person to listen. That's right, Frank said, reaching out to straighten her headband. Life's kind of like that too. Things might sound scary for a while, but that doesn't mean we can't fix them. Emma considered this with the seriousness that children brought to adult problems they didn't fully understand. Do you have the right parts? Frank smiled, and for a moment the weight lifted. I've got the most important part right here, he said, tapping her nose gently. Everything else we'll figure out. The phone rang, cutting through the moment. Frank answered on the third ring. Sullivan's Auto. This is Frank. Frank, it's Jim Bradshaw. The voice belonged to the principal of Emma's school, and Frank's grip tightened on the receiver. I wanted to talk to you about Emma's tuition situation. Frank glanced at Emma, who was pretending to be absorbed in her toy repair, but was clearly listening. Can I call you back, Jim? I'm with a customer right now. Of course, but Frank, we need to discuss this soon. I want to help, but the board is asking questions. After hanging up, Frank stood in the quiet garage surrounded by the tools and equipment that had been his livelihood for the past 8 years since he'd left Boeing. The place wasn't much: concrete floors, fluorescent lights that hummed like insects, and a coffee maker that should have been retired around the time Emma was born, but it was theirs. Emma had taken her first steps in this garage. She'd learned to count by sorting washers and screws. She'd fallen asleep on the old couch in the corner while Frank worked late into the night, a blanket tucked around her small form. This place wasn't just a business, it was home. Grandpa Frank, Emma said, standing up and walking over to him. She slipped her small hand into his larger, calloused one. Whatever's wrong, we'll fix it together, right? Frank squeezed her hand gently. Right, kiddo. We're a team. The best team, Emma declared with 7-year-old certainty. The very best, Frank agreed, though he had no idea how they were going to fix this particular problem. Outside, Portland was waking up. Coffee shops were opening, commuters were hurrying to catch buses, and the city was beginning its daily rhythm. But inside Sullivan's Auto, a grandfather and his granddaughter stood together in the morning light, surrounded by the tools of honest work and the quiet strength that came from knowing that love at least was something that could never be repossessed. Frank picked up the envelope from Northfield Property Management and set it in the drawer with the other bills. There would be time to deal with reality later. Right now, Emma needed breakfast, and there was an engine in the corner that had been making promises to run properly for the past week. Come on, Em, he said, moving toward the corner where Mrs. Chen's Honda waited. Let's see if we can make this old girl purr. As Emma settled beside him with her toy tools, Frank allowed himself a moment to believe that some problems really could be fixed with the right parts and the right person listening, even if he wasn't sure he was that person anymore. The rain arrived without warning, the way September storms often did in Portland. One moment Frank was driving through clear afternoon light, the next he was squinting through windshield wipers that squeaked in protest with every pass. Emma sat in the passenger seat of his pickup truck, her school backpack clutched in her lap, chattering about the science project she was planning. And then Mrs. Peterson said we could use real batteries to make the light bulb work, but I think we should use the kind that come from lemons, like you showed me, because that's more interesting, don't you think, Grandpa? Frank smiled, half listening to Emma's endless stream of consciousness while navigating the suddenly slick streets. They were heading to the pharmacy to pick up Emma's inhaler refill. She'd developed mild asthma the previous winter, another worry to add to his growing list. "Lemons sound perfect, Em," he said, slowing down as the rain intensified. "We can work on it this weekend after we—" He stopped mid-sentence. Up ahead, pulled over on the shoulder of the highway, was a car with its hazard lights blinking. Not just any car, a silver Mercedes sedan that looked like it belonged in a different zip code than this industrial stretch of road. Steam was rising from under the hood, and even through the rain, Frank could see a woman standing beside the driver's door, her posture suggesting frustration and perhaps a touch of desperation. Frank's foot moved toward the brake pedal before his mind had fully processed the decision. "Grandpa, what are you doing?" he asked, noticing their change in direction. "Someone needs help," Frank said, simply pulling over behind the Mercedes. Emma turned to look at the stranded car. "But Grandpa, what if they're dangerous? Mrs. Chen says you should never stop for strangers." Frank put the truck in park and looked at his granddaughter. At 7, Emma was already developing the careful wariness that came from living in a world where adults talked about stranger danger and locked doors as soon as the sun went down. But Frank remembered a different time when helping a stranger was considered basic human decency, not a calculated risk. "And do you see that woman out there in the rain?" Emma pressed her nose to the window. "Yes. Does she look dangerous to you?" Emma studied the figure by the Mercedes, a woman probably in her mid-50s, wearing jeans and a light jacket that was clearly insufficient for the sudden downpour. Her graying hair was plastered to her head, and she was holding what appeared to be a cell phone, though from her gestures it didn't seem to be providing much help. "She looks cold," Emma said after a moment, "and maybe a little scared." "That's what I see too," Frank said. "Sometimes people need help, Em, and sometimes we're the ones who can provide it." He reached into the glove compartment and pulled out an umbrella, ancient and slightly bent, but functional. "You stay in the truck, okay? Keep the doors locked. I'll be right back." Frank stepped out into the rain, immediately feeling the cold water soak through his work shirt. He opened the umbrella and approached the woman, who looked up as he drew near. She had striking green eyes and the kind of bearing that suggested she was accustomed to solving her own problems. The fact that she was standing in the rain beside a broken-down car clearly frustrated her more than it frightened her. "Car trouble?" Frank asked, raising his voice slightly to be heard over the rain. The woman looked him up and down, taking in his work clothes, calloused hands, and the genuine concern in his weathered face. "Engine overheated," she said. "I was hoping it would cool down enough to get me to a gas station, but—" She gestured helplessly at the steam still rising from under the hood. "Mind if I take a look?" Frank asked. "I'm a mechanic." She hesitated for just a moment, then nodded. "I'd appreciate that. I'm Victoria, by the way. Most people call me Vic." "Frank Sullivan," he replied, moving toward the front of the car. "Let's see what we're dealing with." Vic popped the hood, and Frank leaned in, immediately recognizing the problem. "Looks like your radiator hose let go," he said, pointing to the split rubber tube that was the source of the steam. "It's a fairly common problem in cars this age, especially when the weather changes suddenly." "This age?" Vic raised an eyebrow. "This car is only 3 years old." Frank looked at her with surprise. Most people didn't know enough about cars to determine age by looking at the engine, but Vic had spoken with the confidence of someone who understood machinery. "You know cars." "I know engines," she said simply, "just not how to fix them when they break down on the highway." Frank studied the engine compartment more carefully. The Mercedes was indeed relatively new, but someone had clearly been maintaining it meticulously. The oil was clean, the belts were in good condition, and even the small components showed signs of regular care. "The good news is it's fixable," Frank said. "The bad news is you'll need a new hose, and this isn't something you can drive with. The engine will overheat again within a mile or two." Vic sighed, running a hand through her wet hair. "I suppose I need to call a tow truck." "In this weather, on a Friday afternoon," Frank shook his head, "you'll be waiting for hours. Tell you what, I've got some tools in my truck, and there's an auto parts store about 10 minutes from here. I can pick up a hose and have you back on the road in 30 minutes. Vic stared at him. "You would do that for a stranger?" Frank shrugged. "It's what neighbors do." "We're not neighbors," Vic pointed out. "Today we are," Frank replied. "Besides, my granddaughter is watching, and I want her to see that people help each other when they're in trouble. For the first time since he'd approached the car, Vic smiled a real smile that reached her eyes. Your granddaughter, Frank gestured toward his pickup truck, where Emma's face was pressed against the passenger window, watching the interaction with intense curiosity. Emma, she's 7 and she thinks I can fix anything. Can you? Vic asked. Frank considered the question seriously. Most things given enough time and the right parts. People are harder than engines, though. Vic's smile faltered slightly, as if his words had touched something deeper. Yes, she said quietly. They are. 20 minutes later, Frank returned with a new radiator hose and a thermos of hot coffee from the gas station. The rain had lightened to a steady drizzle, and Vic was sitting in her car with the engine off, talking on her phone in what sounded like a business conversation. No, Richard, I told you I'm not interested in meeting with the board, she was saying as Frank approached. My position hasn't changed because some decisions can't be undone with apologies and stock options. That's why. She ended the call as Frank tapped on her window. Ready to get you back on the road, he asked. Vic got out of the car and Frank noticed she moved with the careful precision of someone who was used to being in control. She watched intently as he worked, asking intelligent questions about the repair process and nodding when he explained why certain steps were necessary. You're not just a mechanic, are you? She asked as Frank tightened the final clamp. What do you mean, the way you approach problems, the way you explain things? You have engineering training. Frank paused in his work. Air Force, then Boeing, for 20 years. Worked on everything from transport planes to passenger jets. But that was a long time ago. Why did you leave? Frank glanced toward his truck, where Emma was now reading a book, her small form barely visible through the rain-streaked window. Sometimes life changes your priorities, he said simply. Vic followed his gaze. Is she why you became a mechanic? She's why I do everything I do, Frank replied, closing the hood. All set. The hose should hold indefinitely, but you might want to have someone check your cooling system. Sometimes when one component fails, others aren't far behind. Vic reached for her purse. What do I owe you? Frank shook his head. Nothing. The hose cost $12, but consider it a welcome to the neighborhood gift. I can't let you pay for repairs to my car, Vic protested. You're not letting me do anything, Frank said with a gentle smile. I'm choosing to help someone who needed it. There's a difference. Vic studied his face as if trying to solve a puzzle. People don't usually help strangers without expecting something in return. Maybe you've been meeting the wrong people, Frank suggested. For a moment, they stood in the drizzle, two strangers who had shared a simple act of kindness. Then Vic extended her hand. Thank you, Frank Sullivan. I won't forget this. Her handshake was firm, confident, and Frank noticed she had the kind of hands that suggested she knew how to work despite the expensive car and well-tailored clothes. Take care of yourself, Vic, he said, and drive carefully in this weather. As Frank walked back to his truck, he heard Vic's engine start smoothly. By the time he had settled into the driver's seat, she was already pulling back onto the highway, her taillights disappearing into the gray afternoon. Was she nice, Grandpa? Emma asked, looking up from her book. She was, Frank replied, starting his own engine. And she knew a lot about cars, which was interesting. Do you think we'll see her again? Frank glanced in his rearview mirror, but the Mercedes was long gone. Probably not, Em. Portland's a big city. That's too bad, Emma said thoughtfully. She seemed lonely. Frank looked at his granddaughter with surprise. What made you think that? Emma shrugged. Just the way she stood, like she wasn't used to people helping her. As they drove toward the pharmacy, Frank found himself thinking about Vic's green eyes and the careful way she had spoken about people helping without expecting something in return. Emma was right, there had been something lonely about her, something that suggested she had learned not to expect kindness from strangers. Frank had no way of knowing that the woman he just had helped owned a penthouse apartment downtown, or that she had been driving around the city for hours unable to face returning to the empty space that had once been filled with the noise and chaos of running a successful business. He didn't know that his simple act of kindness had been the first genuine human connection she'd experienced in months. All Frank knew was that he had helped someone who needed it and that Emma had been watching, learning that the world still contained people who chose kindness over suspicion. It seemed like enough. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. We've carefully crafted each scene to show you how one act of kindness can change everything and how sometimes the most unexpected encounters lead to the most meaningful relationships. The story of Frank and Victoria is really just beginning, and what happens next will challenge everything they think they know about trust, family, and second chances. So if you are enjoying this journey with us, please subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us to know that these stories of hope and human connection resonate with you. Your support helps us continue creating content that celebrates the values of integrity, family, and the belief that good people still exist in this world. Now back to the story where Frank is about to discover that sometimes helping a stranger can lead to the most extraordinary changes in your life. The knock came on a Tuesday morning, just as Frank was explaining to Emma why her toy wrench wouldn't actually tighten real bolts. The garage was quiet except for the steady hum of the coffee maker and the distant sound of traffic on MLK Boulevard. Frank looked up from the workbench where he and Emma were sorting through a collection of screws, each one finding its proper place in the organized chaos of his tool system. "Are you expecting someone, Grandpa?" Emma asked, looking toward the front entrance of the garage. "Not this early," Frank replied, wiping his hands on his work shirt. Through the glass door, he could see a figure silhouetted against the morning light. The person appeared to be well-dressed, which usually meant either a lost tourist or someone from the city with paperwork that would complicate his day. Frank opened the door and found himself face-to-face with Vic, the woman he'd helped on the highway 3 days earlier. She looked different in the morning light, more composed, wearing a navy blue coat that probably cost more than Frank made in a month. But her green eyes were the same, and she carried herself with that same careful precision he remembered. "Hello, Frank," she said, offering a slight smile. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Vic," Frank said, genuinely surprised. "Not at all. Emma and I were just organizing bolts. Important work, but nothing that can't wait. How did you find me?" "Sullivan's Auto isn't exactly hidden," she replied, glancing at the hand-painted sign above the garage door. "Though I admit I drove past twice before I worked up the courage to stop." Emma appeared at Frank's elbow, curious about their visitor. She was wearing her school uniform and the miniature tool belt Frank had made for her, looking every inch the junior mechanic. "You must be Emma," Vic said, crouching down to Emma's eye level. "Your grandfather told me you're quite the expert on engines." Emma's face lit up. "I know all about carburetors and alternators and timing belts," she announced proudly. "Grandpa Frank is teaching me everything." "That's impressive," Vic said seriously. "I bet you'll be a better mechanic than most grown-ups before long." "Are you the lady Grandpa helped in the rain?" Emma asked with the directness that 7-year-olds brought to all conversations. "I am," Vic replied. "Your grandfather saved me from a very wet, very frustrating afternoon." Frank stepped aside, gesturing for Vic to come into the garage. "What brings you by car running?" "Okay." "The car is perfect," Vic said, following him inside. She looked around the garage with interest, taking in the organized tool benches, the hydraulic lift, and the corner where Emma had set up her own miniature workspace. "This is nice. How long have you been here?" 8 years, Frank replied. "Took over the lease when the previous owner retired. It's not much, but it's ours." Vic nodded, but something in her expression suggested she was seeing more than just a small neighborhood garage. She moved with the awareness of someone who understood business operations, noting the efficiency of the layout and the quality of the equipment despite its age. "Actually," she said, "I came to properly thank you for your help the other day and to ask if you might have time to look at something for me." "Another car problem?" Frank asked. "Not exactly." Vic glanced at Emma, who was listening with the intensity of a child who knew when adults were about to discuss something interesting. "It's a bit complicated. I have some mechanical equipment that needs attention, but it's not automotive. I was hoping you might be willing to take a look." Frank raised an eyebrow. "What kind of equipment?" "Manufacturing machinery. Old stuff, but well made. The kind of thing that requires someone who really understands how mechanical systems work together." "I might be able to help," Frank said cautiously. "Depends on what we're talking about." Vic seemed to be weighing her words carefully. "Before we go any further, I should probably tell you something about myself. Something I should have mentioned when we met." Emma, sensing that the conversation was about to become more serious, moved closer to Frank. He put a protective hand on her shoulder. "I'm listening," Frank said. Vic took a deep breath. "My name is Victoria Ashford. Until 6 months ago, I was the CEO of Ashford Industries. We manufactured precision components for aircraft engines. Frank's expression didn't change, but Emma's eyes widened. Even at 7, she recognized the weight of important-sounding words. Ashford Industries, Frank repeated slowly. I know that name. You supplied parts to Boeing. Among others, Vic confirmed. For 23 years, I ran the company my father started. We employed 300 people and had contracts with every major aircraft manufacturer in the country. What happened 6 months ago? Frank asked, though something in Vic's posture suggested the answer wouldn't be simple. Vic walked over to Emma's miniature workbench and picked up one of the toy wrenches, turning it over in her hands. I discovered that my business partner, someone I trusted for over a decade, had been embezzling from the company, systematically, carefully for years. By the time I found out, he'd stolen nearly $2 million and set up the books to make it look like I was responsible. Frank felt Emma's grip tighten on his hand. Even without understanding the specifics, children could sense when adults were talking about something that had caused real pain. The board of directors panicked, Vic continued. Rather than conduct a proper investigation, they decided it would be easier to remove me and bring in new management. They offered me a settlement to resign quietly and promised not to pursue legal action. Did you take it? Frank asked. No, Vic said firmly. I refused to accept responsibility for something I didn't do. So they terminated me for cause, publicly accused me of financial misconduct, and effectively destroyed my reputation in the industry. Frank studied her face, looking for signs of deception or self-pity. He found neither. What he saw was the controlled anger of someone who had been betrayed by people she trusted, and the quiet determination of someone who wasn't finished fighting. What about the real embezzler? He asked. Richard Kellerman. Vic's voice carried a bitterness that hadn't been there when she spoke about her own situation. He expressed shock and disappointment at my betrayal of the company's trust. The board appointed him interim CEO while they searched for my permanent replacement. Emma looked up at Frank with confused eyes. But Grandpa, why would someone steal from their own company? Frank knelt down to Emma's level. Sometimes people make bad choices, and sometimes those bad choices hurt other people who didn't deserve it. Like when Tommy Morrison cheated on the spelling test and Mrs. Peterson thought I gave him the answers. Something like that, Frank said gently. But for grown-ups, the consequences are bigger. Vic watched this exchange with interest. You're good with her, she said to Frank. It's not easy to explain adult problems to children without frightening them. Practice, Frank replied, standing up. Emma's dealt with her share of adult problems. Vic looked at Emma with new understanding. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to bring difficult subjects into your space. It's okay, Emma said solemnly. Grandpa says sometimes bad things happen to good people, but that doesn't make them bad people. The simple wisdom of the statement seemed to hit Vic unexpectedly. For a moment, her composed facade wavered, and Frank caught a glimpse of the pain she'd been carrying. Your grandfather is a wise man, Vic said softly. So what happens now? Frank asked. Are you fighting the accusations? I'm trying to, Vic replied, but legal battles take time and money, and the damage to my reputation makes it difficult to find work. Most people in the aerospace industry have heard the allegations, and few are willing to take a chance on someone who's been publicly accused of embezzlement. Frank began to understand why Vic had seemed so surprised by his willingness to help a stranger. In her world, trust had become a luxury she could no longer afford. What does this have to do with mechanical equipment? He asked. Vic smiled for the first time since beginning her story. That's where it gets interesting. Before my father died, he set up a trust that owned certain assets independently of the company, including some prototype manufacturing equipment that's stored in a warehouse across town. Equipment that contains design specifications and production records that could prove my innocence. But you can't access it. I can access it, Vic said, but I can't operate it. The machinery is from the 1970s, beautiful, precise analog equipment that requires someone who understands mechanical systems from that era, someone who learned to work with tools instead of computers. Frank was beginning to see where this was leading. And you think I might be that someone. I know you are, Vic said confidently. The way you diagnosed my car's problem, the questions you asked, the precision of your repair work, you have exactly the kind of mechanical intuition this equipment requires. Emma tugged on Frank's shirt. Grandpa does. This mean we're going to help the lady prove she didn't steal anything. Frank looked down at his granddaughter, then back at Vic. It's not that simple, Em. This isn't like fixing a car. This is about legal problems and business disputes. But she's innocent, right? Emma asked with the clarity that children brought to questions adults preferred to complicate. I believe so, Frank said carefully. Then we should help her, Emma declared. You always say we should help people who need it. Vic looked at Emma with something approaching wonder. You raised her well, she said to Frank. She raises herself mostly, Frank replied. I just try to keep up. The garage fell quiet except for the distant hum of traffic and the steady tick of the clock on Frank's workbench. Frank found himself at a crossroads he hadn't expected when he'd opened the door that morning. Helping someone change a tire was one thing. Getting involved in corporate legal battles was something else entirely. What exactly would you need me to do, he asked finally. Come with me to the warehouse, Vic said. Help me operate the machinery long enough to access the production records. The whole process shouldn't take more than a few hours. And you think these records will prove your innocence? I know they will, Vic said with quiet certainty. The embezzlement involved you to falsifying production costs and inflating material expenses. The real records will show exactly how the money was diverted. Frank considered the proposition. It seemed straightforward enough and Vic's story had the ring of truth. But he'd learned to be cautious about situations that seemed too simple. Why me? He asked. Surely you know other people with mechanical skills. Vic's smile was rueful. Frank, I've learned that most people are only willing to help when it's convenient and risk-free. You helped me on the highway because it was the right thing to do, not because you expected anything in return. That's exactly the kind of person I need right now. Emma looked up at Frank with expectant eyes. At 7, she had already developed an intuitive sense of right and wrong, and her expression suggested she'd already decided which choice her grandfather should make. Frank thought about the rent notice in his desk drawer, about Emma's tuition, about the uncertain future of Sullivan's auto. He thought about Vic standing in the rain beside her broken-down car, grateful for the simple kindness of a stranger. He thought about the values he was trying to teach Emma about helping others and doing the right thing. When, he asked. Vic's relief was visible. This weekend, if possible. Saturday morning. I'll pay you for your time, of course. We'll figure out the payment later, Frank said. Right now, I'm more interested in seeing this equipment you're talking about. As Vic prepared to leave, she knelt down one more time to talk to Emma. Thank you for encouraging your grandfather to help me, she said seriously. I think you're going to grow up to be an extraordinary woman. Emma beamed. Are you going to come back after Grandpa helps you with the machines? Vic glanced at Frank, then back at Emma. Would you like me to? Yes, Emma said without hesitation. I want to hear more about making airplane parts. And I think you're lonely. The directness of the observation clearly caught Vic off guard. For a moment, her composed facade slipped entirely, revealing the isolation she'd been carrying. I think I'd like that too, she said softly. After Vic left, Frank and Emma returned to their bolt-sorting project, but the garage felt different now, charged with possibility and the weight of new responsibility. Grandpa, Emma said, as she carefully placed a washer in its designated container. Do you think the lady will be okay? Frank considered the question seriously. I think she's stronger than she knows, he said. And I think sometimes good people need help fighting bad people. Are we going to be her helpers? Frank smiled at his granddaughter's matter-of-fact approach to complex situations. Yeah, Em, I think we are. As the morning progressed and regular customers began arriving for oil changes and tune-ups, Frank found his mind returning to Vic's story. Something about her situation resonated with him, the betrayal by trusted colleagues, the destruction of a life's work, the struggle to maintain dignity in the face of false accusations. But it was Emma's simple question that stayed with him. She's innocent, right? In his granddaughter's world, innocence deserved protection, and wrong deserved to be made right. It was a clarity Frank had lost somewhere in the complications of adult life, but one he was grateful to rediscover. By closing time, Frank had made his decision completely. Whatever risks helping Vic might involve, they were outweighed by the chance to teach Emma that good people still fought for truth, and that sometimes ordinary people could make an extraordinary difference. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October clarity that made Portland feel like the most beautiful city in the world. Frank and Emma drove through the industrial district on the east side of the river, following Vic's directions to a warehouse complex that had seen better decades. The buildings were solid but weathered the kind of post-war construction that prioritized function over form. "That's it," Emma said, pointing to a tan brick building with Ashford Manufacturing Archive, painted in faded letters across the front. "Number 47. Frank parked beside Vic's Mercedes, noting that she'd arrived early. Through the large windows, he could see her moving around inside, preparing for their work session. "Remember what we talked about, Em," Frank said as they got out of the truck. "This is grown-up business. If Mrs. Ashford and I need to focus on the machinery, you've got your books and your drawing supplies." "I know, Grandpa," Emma replied, adjusting her small backpack. "But can I watch when you're working?" "I promise I'll be quiet." "We'll see how it goes," Frank said, though he was already planning to include Emma as much as possible. Some of his best memories were of working alongside his own grandfather, learning by observation and careful questions. Vic met them at the entrance wearing jeans and a work shirt that looked expensive but practical. She seemed more relaxed than she had in the garage, as if being in this space connected her to something essential about herself. "Good morning," she said, smiling at Emma. "I brought hot chocolate since I remember someone mentioning she likes it with extra marshmallows." Emma's face lit up. "You remembered. I pay attention to important details," Vic replied, leading them into the warehouse. Frank stopped just inside the door, impressed despite himself. The space was meticulously organized with vintage manufacturing equipment arranged in logical groupings. Everything was clean, well-maintained, and labeled with a kind of precision that spoke to serious engineering standards. "This is incredible," he said, moving toward a massive milling machine that probably dated to the 1960s. "Your father collected this?" "Built most of it himself," Vic replied with obvious pride. "Dad believed that understanding machinery meant working with your hands, not just reading computer specifications. He insisted that every engineer in the company spend time in the shop learning how things actually worked." Emma gravitated toward a smaller machine near the center of the room, standing on her tiptoes to peer at the controls. "What does this one do?" Vic walked over to join her. "That's a precision lathe. It cuts metal into exact shapes by spinning the piece while a cutting tool shapes it. Want to see how it works?" For the next hour, Vic gave Frank and Emma a tour of the equipment, explaining each machine's purpose and demonstrating basic operations. Frank was impressed by her knowledge. She didn't just understand the theoretical principles, but could operate every piece of equipment with the confidence of someone who'd spent real time learning the craft. "Your father taught you well," Frank said as they paused beside a complex-looking machine that resembled a cross between a printing press and a scientific instrument. "He taught me that engineering without craftsmanship is just mathematics," Vic replied, "and that you can't truly understand how to build something until you've built it yourself." Emma, who had been listening intently, raised her hand like she was in school. "Mrs. Ashford, did you make airplane parts with these machines?" "I did," Vic said seriously. "Some of the components that went into the planes your grandfather worked on at Boeing might have been made right here in this room." Emma's eyes widened as she processed this connection. "So you and Grandpa Frank were like teammates even before you met?" Vic and Frank exchanged a look of surprise. Neither had considered this possibility, but Emma's logic was undeniable. "I suppose we were," Vic said thoughtfully. "The aviation industry is like a big puzzle. Lots of different people work on different pieces, but they all have to fit together perfectly." "That's why Grandpa Frank is so good at fixing things," Emma announced. "He understands how all the pieces work together." As they moved deeper into the warehouse, Frank began to understand what Vic needed from him. Near the back of the space sat a machine unlike the others, older, more complex, with mechanical computing elements that predated digital systems by decades. "That's the production record archive," Vic explained. "It's essentially a mechanical database. Every production run, every material order, every cost calculation was recorded on these metal plates." She gestured to thousands of thin metal discs organized in tall filing systems. "The information is encoded mechanically. You need to operate the machine to read the records." Frank studied the system with growing fascination. "It's like a player piano for data storage." "Exactly," Vic said, pleased by his understanding. "The problem is I know what information I need to find, but operating the machine requires more mechanical skill than I have. It's not just pushing buttons. You have to adjust tension, calibrate reading, heads, synchronize multiple mechanical processes. And you think I can figure it out? I know you can, Vic said confidently. This machine operates on the same principles as aircraft engine-controlled systems from the 1970s. The mechanical logic is identical. Frank approached the machine, running his hands over the controls with the careful attention he brought to unfamiliar engines. The system was complex but logical, built with the kind of over-engineering that characterized precision manufacturing from that era. It'll take some time to understand the operating sequence, he said. But yeah, I think I can work with this. Emma had been exploring the area around the machine and made a discovery. Look, she called out, pointing to a small workstation set up beside the main equipment. There's a little chair and a desk, just my size. Vic smiled. My father built that for me when I was about your age. I used to come here on weekends and pretend to help while he worked. Just like me and Grandpa Frank, Emma exclaimed. As Frank began familiarizing himself with the archive machine, Vic and Emma settled at the small workstation where Vic found a collection of blueprint fragments and began showing Emma how to read technical drawings. See these lines? Vic said, pointing to a schematic. Each one represents a different part of the engine, and these numbers tell us how big each part needs to be. It's like a recipe for making an airplane, Emma said with sudden understanding. That's a perfect way to think about it, Vic replied. Except instead of cups and teaspoons, we measure in thousands of inches. Frank worked steadily, gradually decoding the machine's operating sequence while listening to Vic and Emma's conversation. He was struck by Vic's patience with Emma's questions and her ability to explain complex concepts in ways a 7-year-old could understand. Mrs. Ashford, Emma said during a lull in their blueprint discussion, are you sad about losing your company? The question was asked with the directness that only children could manage, cutting straight to the emotional heart of Vic's situation. Vic was quiet for a moment, considering how to answer honestly without burdening Emma with adult complexities. Yes, she said finally, I'm sad because I worked very hard to build something good and then bad people took it away. But I'm also hopeful because your grandfather is helping me prove that I didn't do anything wrong. Will you get your company back? Emma asked. I don't know, Vic admitted, but even if I don't, at least people will know the truth. Sometimes that's the most important thing. Emma nodded solemnly as if this made perfect sense to her. Grandpa Frank says telling the truth is always right, even when it's hard. Well, your grandfather is a very smart man, Vic said, glancing over at Frank, who was deep in concentration at the archive machine. By lunchtime, Frank had successfully operated the machine and retrieved several sample records confirming that the system contained exactly the information Vic needed. They broke for sandwiches that Vic had brought sitting on folding chairs in the warehouse's main area. This is like a picnic in a museum, Emma observed, looking around at the vintage machinery while eating her peanut butter and jelly sandwich. I never thought of it that way, Vic said. But you're right. All of this equipment tells the story of how things used to be made. Tell us about when you were little, Emma requested. Did you always want to make airplane parts? Vic laughed. When I was your age, I wanted to be a pilot. I thought making the parts would be boring compared to flying the planes. What changed your mind? Frank asked. My father took me up in a small plane when I was 10, Vic replied. I loved flying, but what really fascinated me was when he opened the engine compartment and showed me how all the parts work together. He said, pilots get to experience the magic, but engineers get to create it. Emma considered this seriously. I think I want to create magic too, she announced. You already do, Vic said softly. Every time you help your grandfather, every time you ask smart questions, every time you see solutions instead of problems, that's creating magic. Frank watched the interaction between Vic and Emma with growing amazement. His granddaughter, who was often shy around new adults, had opened up completely to Vic. And Vic, who had initially seemed guarded and businesslike, revealed warmth and patience that suggested she was genuinely enjoying Emma's company. After lunch, they returned to work with renewed focus. Frank had mastered the archive machine's operation, and they began systematically retrieving the production records Vic needed. Each metal disc contained months of detailed information, and Frank marveled at the precision of the mechanical encoding system. Your father was brilliant, he said as they worked. This system is more reliable than most digital storage. And it can't be hacked or corrupted remotely, Vic added. Dad built it specifically to be tamper-proof. Emma, meanwhile, had appointed herself the official record organizer, carefully arranging the retrieved discs in chronological order and making notes about what each one contained. "I'm like your assistant," she announced proudly. Assistant Emma reporting for duty. "Assistant Emma is doing excellent work," Vic replied seriously. "I couldn't manage this project without her organizational skills." Emma beamed at the recognition, and Frank felt his heart swell. It had been a long time since he'd seen his granddaughter this engaged and confident around new people. As the afternoon wore on, a comfortable rhythm developed between the three of them. Frank operated the machinery with increasing efficiency, Vic interpreted the retrieved data, and Emma maintained their organizational system while asking endless questions about engineering and manufacturing. "Grandpa Frank," Emma said during one of their breaks, "is this what you used to do at Boeing?" "Similar," Frank replied, "though the systems I worked with were more modern. But the principles are the same: precision, attention to detail, understanding how all the parts work together." "Do you miss it?" Vic asked quietly. "Working on bigger projects, I mean." Frank considered the question carefully. "Sometimes," he admitted. "I miss the complexity of aircraft systems, the feeling of working on something that really mattered. But I wouldn't trade what I have now." He looked at Emma, who was absorbed in organizing their records. "Some things are more important than career advancement." Vic followed his gaze to Emma. "She's lucky to have you." "I'm the lucky one," Frank replied. "She keeps me focused on what really matters." By late afternoon, they had retrieved all the records Vic needed to build her case. The metal discs told a clear story of systematic financial manipulation that had nothing to do with Vic's management of the company. "This is it," Vic said, examining the final set of records. "This proves everything. Richard's signature on falsified invoices, the routing of diverted funds, the timeline of the embezzlement. My lawyers will be able to build an airtight case with this evidence." "So you'll get your company back?" Emma asked hopefully. "It's not that simple," Vic explained gently. "But at least my name will be cleared, and the real thief will face justice, Marisol." Emma must seem satisfied with this outcome. "Good," she declared. "Bad people should get in trouble for doing bad things." As they prepared to leave, Vic surprised Frank by addressing Emma directly. "Assistant Emma, I was wondering if you and your grandfather might be interested in a consulting contract." Emma's eyes widened. "What's a consulting contract?" "It means I would hire you both to help me with more mechanical projects," Vic explained. "I have other equipment that needs attention, and I think we make a good team." Emma looked at Frank with excitement. "Can we, Grandpa, please?" Frank was touched by the offer, but also cautious. "Vic, you don't need to create work for us out of gratitude." "This isn't about gratitude," Vic replied firmly. "It's about recognizing talent and expertise when I see it. You have skills I need, and Emma has insights that surprise me. I'd be honored to work with both of you." Emma tugged on Frank's shirt. "It would be like having more adventures together." Frank looked at his granddaughter's excited face, then at Vic's earnest expression. The offer represented more than just additional income. It was a chance for Emma to learn from someone with deep technical knowledge and an opportunity for Frank to work on challenging projects again. "All right," he said finally, "but we do this as equals. No charity, no special favors. Just honest work for fair pay." "Deal," Vic said, extending her hand for a handshake. "Partners." "Partners," Frank agreed. Emma insisted on shaking hands too, making their agreement all official. As they packed up their materials and prepared to leave the warehouse, Frank realized that this day had been about more than retrieving archived records. They had formed the foundation of an unexpected friendship built on mutual respect and shared values. "Mrs. Ashford," Emma said as they walked toward their cars, "would you like to come to dinner tomorrow? Grandpa Frank makes really good spaghetti, and I can show you my room." Vic looked surprised by the invitation, then pleased. "I would love that," she said. "Should I bring anything?" "Just yourself," Frank replied. "Emma's right, we do make good spaghetti, and I think there's more we should talk about." As they drove home, Emma chattered excitedly about their day, but Frank found himself thinking about the way Vic had interacted with his granddaughter. She hadn't talked down to Emma or dismissed her questions as childish interruptions. Instead, she had treated Emma as a legitimate part of their team, someone whose contributions mattered. "Grandpa," Emma said as they pulled into the garage, "I really like Mrs. Ashford. She's smart and nice, and she explains things so I can understand them." I like her too, Frank replied. I think she's going to be a good friend. Do you think she's still lonely? Emma asked with the perceptiveness that continued to amaze Frank. Maybe a little, Frank said, but I think that's changing. As they climbed the stairs to their apartment above the garage, Frank reflected on how much had changed since Vic had first knocked on his door. What had started as a simple request for mechanical help had evolved into something richer, a connection between three people who had found in each other exactly what they hadn't known they were looking for. The phone call came at 6:15 on a Wednesday morning, jarring Frank from the deep sleep that came after a long day of rebuilding transmissions. He fumbled for the receiver in the darkness, immediately alert in the way that fathers and grandfathers learned to be when early calls could mean emergencies. Frank, it's Vic. Her voice was tight, controlled, but Frank could hear the strain underneath. I'm sorry to call so early, but I need your help. Something's happened. Frank sat up, glancing toward Emma's room to make sure his granddaughter was still sleeping. What kind of something? The warehouse was broken into last night. The archive machine was damaged, and most of the records we retrieved are missing. Frank felt his stomach drop. Over the past 3 weeks, he and Emma had been working with Vic regularly, helping her organize the evidence for her legal case while building what had become a genuine friendship. The three of them had fallen into a comfortable rhythm, Frank providing mechanical expertise, Emma offering organizational skills and endless questions, and Vic sharing her knowledge of engineering and manufacturing. How bad is the damage? Frank asked, already reaching for his clothes. Bad enough that the machine won't operate without major repairs. And Frank, Vic's voice cracked slightly. The timing can't be coincidental. My lawyers were supposed to file the preliminary motion tomorrow. Someone knew exactly what we were doing. Frank pulled on his jeans, his mind racing. Who else knew about the warehouse? That's what I can't figure out, Vic replied. The trust that owns the building has been completely confidential. Even my lawyers don't know the specific location of the archive. Where are you now? At the warehouse with the police. But Frank, there's something else, something worse. Frank paused in putting on his shirt. What? Richard Kellerman filed a restraining order yesterday afternoon. He's claiming I've been harassing him and threatening corporate property. The order prohibits me from accessing any Ashford Industries facilities or records, including the warehouse. The full implication hit Frank like a physical blow. So, even if we can repair the machine, I can't legally be present when it's operated, Vic finished. And without my presence to authenticate the records, they won't be admissible in court. Frank ran his hand through his gray hair, trying to process the legal maneuvering. This Kellerman guy is smarter than you gave him credit for. He always was, Vic said bitterly. I just never thought he'd be this ruthless. Frank heard movement from Emma's room. His granddaughter was an early riser, and the sound of his voice had probably awakened her. Vic, I need to get Emma ready for school, but then I'm coming over. We'll figure this out. Frank, I can't ask you to get more involved in this. It's getting complicated in ways I didn't anticipate. You're not asking, Frank replied firmly. I'm offering. Partners don't abandon each other when things get difficult. After hanging up, Frank found Emma in the kitchen, already dressed for school, and attempting to pour cereal into a bowl that was too small for her ambitious serving size. Who was on the phone, Grandpa? She asked, looking up from her breakfast preparation. You sounded worried. Frank sat down beside her, helping to relocate some of the escaped cereal. Mrs. Ashford, someone broke into the warehouse and damaged the machine we've been working with. Emma's face fell. Did they steal our records? Some of them, Frank confirmed. But this is grown-up trouble, the kind that might involve lawyers and courts. Emma considered this seriously. Are we still going to help her? The question went straight to the heart of Frank's dilemma. Getting more deeply involved in Vic's legal battle could expose him and Emma to complications he wasn't prepared for. But walking away now felt like abandoning someone who had become important to both of them. What do you think we should do? Frank asked, genuinely curious about his granddaughter's perspective. Emma didn't hesitate. We help her, she said firmly. She's our friend, and friends help each other when bad things happen. Frank smiled despite his concerns. Even when helping might be difficult. Especially then, Emma replied with 7-year-old certainty. That's when friends need help the most. An hour later, after dropping Emma at school with Mrs. Chen, who had become their regular morning childcare arrangement, Frank drove to the warehouse district. He found Vic standing outside the building with two police officers and a man in an expensive suit who Frank assumed was her attorney. "Frank," Vic said as he approached, "thank you for coming. This is David Morrison, my lawyer." Morrison shook Frank's hand with the firm grip of someone accustomed to making serious impressions. "Mr. Sullivan, Victoria has told me about your assistance with the archive project. I'm afraid we're facing some significant legal obstacles." Frank looked past them toward the warehouse entrance where yellow police tape blocked access to the building. "Can I see the damage?" "The police are finished with their initial investigation," Morrison said, "but the restraining order prohibits Victoria from entering the premises." "What about me?" Frank asked. "I'm not named in the restraining order." Morrison and Vic exchanged a look. "Technically, no," Morrison said slowly, "but given your association with Victoria, it could be argued that your presence violates the spirit of the order." Frank studied the lawyer's expression. "But it could also be argued that as an independent contractor hired to maintain the equipment, I have legitimate business being here." "That's not an unreasonable interpretation," Morrison admitted. Vic stepped closer to Frank. "I can't ask you to take that risk. If Kellerman's people decide to pursue criminal charges—" "They won't," Frank said with confidence he didn't entirely feel, "because I'm not going to do anything criminal. I'm going to assess damage to machinery I was hired to maintain." 20 minutes later, Frank stood alone in the warehouse surveying the destruction. The break-in had been professional and targeted only the archive machine, and its associated record storage had been damaged. The vintage manufacturing equipment was untouched, suggesting the intruders knew exactly what they were looking for. The archive machine's mechanical reading heads had been deliberately damaged, and the filing system containing the metal record discs had been ransacked. Frank estimated that about 60% of the retrieved records were missing, with the remainder scattered across the floor. He photographed everything methodically, then began collecting the remaining records. As he worked, Frank noticed something the intruders had missed. Several discs had rolled under other equipment, escaping the systematic theft. Frank's phone buzzed with a text from Vic. "Police leaving. Morrison says we need to discuss legal options. Can you meet us for lunch?" Frank replied. "Found something. Meet you at the diner on MLK in an hour." The Riverside Diner was the kind of place where coffee was always fresh, conversations were private, and nobody paid attention to serious discussions happening in corner booths. Frank arrived first, choosing a table near the back where they could talk without being overheard. Vic and Morrison arrived together, both looking like people who had spent the morning dealing with unpleasant realities. "What did you find?" Vic asked as soon as they sat down. Frank placed a small box on the table. 15 discs that the thieves missed. They're not complete records, but they might contain enough information to establish a pattern. Morrison leaned forward. "Could these be authenticated without Victoria's presence?" "Depends on what kind of authentication you need," Frank replied. "The discs themselves are date-stamped and encoded with production signatures. If you had an expert witness who understood the mechanical encoding system—" "You," Vic said quietly. Frank had been expecting this moment, but it still felt like stepping off a cliff. "I'm not qualified to testify about financial records or corporate governance, but I could testify about the mechanical integrity of the archive system and the authenticity of the encoding process." Morrison was taking notes. "That might be enough to get the records admitted as evidence. But Frank, you need to understand testifying in this case will make you a target for Kellerman's legal team. They'll try to discredit your testimony, question your motives, possibly even investigate your background." Frank thought about Emma, about the garage, about the quiet life they'd built together. Then he thought about Vic standing in the rain beside her broken-down car, grateful for simple kindness. He thought about the way she'd patiently explained engineering concepts to Emma, treating his granddaughter like an intelligent person whose questions mattered. "What happens if we don't fight this?" Frank asked. "Kellerman gets away with embezzling $2 million, Vic said quietly. "The real financial records disappear forever, and my reputation remains destroyed." "And what happens if we do fight it?" Morrison answered this time. "We go to court with incomplete evidence and hope a jury believes our reconstruction of events. It's risky, and there are no guarantees." Frank looked at Vic across the table. 3 weeks ago, she'd been a stranger with car trouble. Now she was someone who mattered to him, and Emma someone whose fight had become their fight. "There's something else you should know," Vic said suddenly. "This morning I received an offer from Kellerman's attorneys. They're willing to settle for a public apology and my agreement never to pursue legal action. In exchange, they'll withdraw the restraining order and provide a modest financial settlement." "How modest?" Frank asked. "Enough to start over somewhere else," Vic replied. "But not enough to clear my name or recover what was stolen." Frank understood the implications immediately. "They're offering you a way out." "They're offering me exile," Vic corrected, "a chance to disappear quietly and let them keep what they stole." The waitress approached their table, but Morrison waved her away. This wasn't a conversation that could be interrupted by discussions of lunch specials. "What does your gut tell you?" Frank asked Vic. "My gut tells me that giving up now means everything my father built was for nothing," Vic replied. "It means the people who worked for Ashford Industries for decades will never know what really happened to their company. It means Kellerman wins." Frank nodded slowly. "And fighting back means risking everything on a legal case that might fail. It also means teaching my granddaughter that some things are worth fighting for," Vic said quietly, echoing Frank's own thoughts. Frank looked at Morrison. "If we proceed with the case, what's the timeline?" "The preliminary hearing is scheduled for next week," Morrison replied. "If we can get the remaining records authenticated and admitted as evidence, we might be able to establish enough doubt about the original charges to proceed to a full trial. And if we can't, the case gets dismissed and Victoria remains legally responsible for the missing funds." Frank sat back in the booth weighing options that all seemed to involve significant risks. But Emma's words from that morning echoed in his mind. Friends help each other when bad things happen. "Vic," he said finally, "what do you want to do?" She met his eyes with the same determination he'd seen when she'd refused to accept blame for crimes she didn't commit. "I want to fight," she said, "but I can't ask you to risk your life and Emma's security for my battle." Frank thought about the values he was trying to teach his granddaughter, about the kind of man he wanted to be, about the difference between safety and cowardice. "You're not asking," he said. "I'm choosing. We're in this together." Vic's relief was visible. "Thank you," she said softly. Morrison cleared his throat. "Before we proceed, I need to make sure everyone understands the stakes. If we lose this case, Victoria could face criminal charges for embezzlement. Frank could be charged as an accessory for helping access records after the restraining order was filed. These are serious potential consequences." Frank looked at the lawyer steadily. "What are the stakes if we don't fight?" "Kellerman continues running Ashford Industries into the ground while pocketing whatever he can steal," Morrison replied. "Victoria's reputation remains destroyed, and a thief gets away with $2 million. Those seem like serious consequences too," Frank observed. As they left the diner, Frank realized that this moment represented a fundamental shift in their relationship. What had started as a simple favor for a stranded motorist had evolved into something much more significant, a shared commitment to fighting for truth and justice, regardless of the personal cost. "Frank," Vic said as they walked toward their cars, "are you sure about this? Once we file the motion to admit the remaining evidence, there's no going back." Frank thought about Emma waiting for him at school, trusting that her grandfather would always make the right choice. He thought about the kind of story he wanted their life together to tell. "I'm sure," he said. "Let's go prove your innocence." The coffee shop on Hawthorne Boulevard was busy enough to provide cover for a serious conversation, but quiet enough that Frank could think clearly. He'd been staring at the same cup of black coffee for 20 minutes, turning over Vic's proposal in his mind while watching Portland's familiar rhythm play out through the window. Emma sat across from him, working on homework with the focused concentration she brought to everything important. They'd made this their regular after-school stop since the warehouse break-in 3 days earlier, a neutral space where Frank could process the complexity of their situation while Emma completed her assignments. "Grandpa," Emma said, without looking up from her math worksheet, "you're doing the thinking thing again." Frank smiled despite his concerns. "What thinking thing?" "The thing where you stare at your coffee and your forehead gets all wrinkly," Emma replied, pencil moving steadily across the page. "You only do it when you're worrying about grown-up stuff." Frank realized his granddaughter had become remarkably adept at reading his moods. "You're getting too smart for your own good, kiddo." "Mrs. Chen says smart is good," Emma observed. She says smart people ask good questions. What questions would you ask if you were me? Emma looked up from her homework, considering the question with the seriousness she brought to hypothetical scenarios. I'd ask what the right thing to do is, and then I'd ask if I'm brave enough to do it. Frank stared at his granddaughter, amazed once again by her ability to cut through adult complications and identify the essential issues. Those are exactly the right questions, Em. So what are the answers? Before Frank could respond, Vic appeared at their table carrying a manila folder and wearing the expression of someone who'd spent the morning dealing with lawyers. Sorry I'm late, she said, sliding into the empty chair beside Emma. Morrison wanted to review the motion one more time before I presented this to you. Emma looked up from her homework. Hi, Mrs. Ashford. Are you here for the important meeting? I am, Vic replied seriously, though I think your homework might be more important than anything we're discussing. It's long division, Emma said with a slight grimace. I don't think it's as important as helping you prove you didn't steal money. Vic and Frank exchanged a look. They tried to shield Emma from the more serious aspects of the legal case, but she'd absorbed more than they'd realized. Frank said gently, maybe you could work on your homework while Mrs. Ashford and I talk. Emma nodded agreeably, but Frank noticed she positioned herself so she could listen while appearing to focus on mathematics. Vic opened the manila folder and spread several documents across the table. Morrison filed our motion to admit the recovered evidence this morning. The preliminary hearing is scheduled for Friday. What are our chances? Frank asked. Better than they were a week ago, thanks to your testimony about the archive system, Vic replied. But Morrison thinks Kellerman's team will challenge every aspect of our evidence. They're going to argue that the records were tampered with, that the archive system is unreliable, that our entire case is built on speculation. Frank studied the legal documents, understanding enough to recognize the complexity of what they were attempting. And if they succeed in getting our evidence excluded, the original charges against me stand, and I become legally responsible for $2 million in missing funds, Vic said quietly. Emma's pencil stopped moving, though she didn't look up from her homework. Vic continued, but Morrison also presented me with another option, something we hadn't considered before. What kind of option? Vic took a deep breath. A strategic partnership. Morrison thinks we might be able to strengthen our case if we can demonstrate ongoing business collaboration between us. It would establish that my relationship with you is professional rather than personal, which could counter their arguments about bias and collusion. Frank raised an eyebrow. What kind of business collaboration? A formal consulting partnership, Vic explained. Sullivan Ashford Technical Services. You would provide mechanical expertise. I would provide engineering consultation. We'd be equal partners in a legitimate business entity. Frank was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. And this would help our legal case. How? It would establish that our working relationship predates the legal troubles, Vic said. It would demonstrate that your testimony is based on professional expertise rather than personal loyalty. And it would provide documentary evidence of our legitimate business activities. Emma's homework had been completely forgotten now, though she was still pretending to work on long division. There's something else, Vic continued. Something more significant. Morrison thinks we should consider making our partnership more comprehensive. Meaning, Austin, Vic looked uncomfortable, as if she were about to suggest something that violated her principles. A marriage of convenience. A legal arrangement that would provide maximum protection for both of us during the court proceedings. Frank felt as if the coffee shop had suddenly become very quiet. A what? Not a real marriage, Vic said quickly. A legal partnership designed to protect our assets and provide joint legal standing. It would prevent Kellerman's team from forcing us to testify against each other, and it would establish our collaboration as a family business rather than a casual arrangement. Emma's pencil dropped onto her homework paper with a small sound that seemed loud in the sudden silence. Frank stared at Vic, trying to process what she was suggesting. You want us to get married to strengthen your legal case. I want us to consider every option that might prevent an innocent person from going to prison, Vic replied firmly. And according to Morrison, this would provide significant legal advantages. Frank looked at Emma, who was now openly listening to the conversation with wide eyes. Mrs. Ashford, Emma said in a small voice, are you asking my grandpa to marry you? Vic's face flushed slightly. It's not that simple, Emma. It would be a legal arrangement, not a romantic relationship, more like a business contract. Emma frowned. But married people are supposed to love each other. Usually, Vic agreed, but sometimes people get married for other reasons, to protect each other or to solve problems or to help their families. Frank found his voice. Vic, this is a lot to consider. You're talking about changing our entire lives to fight a legal case. I'm talking about using every legal tool available to prevent a miscarriage of justice, Vic replied. But Frank, I would never ask you to do something that could harm Emma. If you think this arrangement could negatively affect her. Well, it wouldn't negatively affect me, Emma interrupted quietly. I like Mrs. Ashford. She's nice and she's smart and she explains things so I can understand them. Both adults looked at Emma in surprise. Frank said gently, this isn't the kind of decision children make. I know, Emma replied, but it is the kind of decision that affects children. And I think if it helps Mrs. Ashford prove she didn't do anything wrong, then maybe it's a good idea. Vic leaned forward. Emma, do you understand what we're talking about? If your grandfather and I got married, even just legally, it would mean big changes for all of us. We'd probably live together, share responsibilities, make decisions as a family. Emma considered this seriously. Would you still teach me about engineering? Of course, Vic replied. And would Grandpa Frank still fix cars? Yes, Vic said, though we might also work on bigger projects together. Emma looked at Frank. Would we still live above the garage? Frank realized his granddaughter was approaching this decision with the same methodical logic she applied to her homework. We'd have to figure out living arrangements, he said carefully. Mrs. Ashford has her own place downtown. The penthouse is beautiful, Emma said thoughtfully, but the garage is home. Vic watched this exchange with growing understanding. Emma, what if we found a way to keep the garage as our workshop and office, but live somewhere with more space for all of us? Like where? Like a house with a real kitchen and a yard, but close enough to the garage that your grandfather could still work on cars every day. Emma's eyes lit up. A house with a yard, could we get a bow? No. Frank and Vic looked at each other, both recognizing that the conversation had taken an unexpected turn toward practical family planning rather than legal strategy. Emma, Frank said, we're not talking about getting a dog right now. We're talking about whether this legal arrangement would be good for all of us. But if we're going to be a family, even just a pretend family, shouldn't we think about family things? Emma asked with unassailable logic. Vic smiled at Emma's directness. She has a point. If we're going to ask a court to believe we're a legitimate family business, we should probably act like a legitimate family. Frank rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of a decision that seemed to be growing more complex by the minute. Vic, what you're proposing, it's not just about the legal case anymore, is it? Vic was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about that, she said finally. When this all started, I was focused on clearing my name and recovering what was stolen. But working with you and Emma these past few weeks, it's reminded me what it feels like to be part of something meaningful. What do you mean? I mean that for the first time since I lost the company, I felt useful, needed, like my skills and experience matter to people who value them. Vic paused, glancing at Emma, who was listening intently. I've also remembered what it feels like to care about people more than projects. Frank studied Vic's face, looking for signs of manipulation or desperation. What he saw was honest vulnerability and a longing for connection that he recognized because he'd felt it himself. Frank, Vic continued, I won't pretend this arrangement would be without complications, but I think we could build something good together, not just a legal strategy, but a real partnership, a family that works. Emma raised her hand like she was in school. Can I ask a question? Of course, Vic replied. If you and Grandpa Frank got married, would you promise to be nice to each other and to take care of each other like real married people do? The question caught both adults off guard. Emma had identified the emotional core of their arrangement with typical 7-year-old directness. Yes, Vic said softly, looking at Frank. I would promise that. Frank felt something shift inside him. What Vic was proposing wasn't just a legal convenience, it was an offer of partnership, support, and shared responsibility. It was a chance to build something larger than the sum of its parts. There's something I need to tell you both, Frank said finally. The garage is in trouble. The rent is being raised by 40%, and I don't have the money to cover it. Without additional income, Emma and I will have to move within the next 2 months. Emma's face fell. Grandpa, why didn't you tell me? Because it's not your problem to solve, kiddo, Frank replied gently. It's mine. Vic leaned forward. What if it became our problem to solve together? Frank looked at his granddaughter, then at Vic. You're talking about combining households, sharing finances, making legal commitments that could affect the rest of our lives. That's not something to decide lightly. No, Vic agreed, but it's also not something to dismiss out of fear. Frank, I have the resources to save the garage. You have the skills and knowledge I need for my work. Emma has the wisdom to see that sometimes the best solutions are the ones we don't expect. Emma reached across the table and put her small hand on Frank's arm. Grandpa, remember what you taught me about engines. Sometimes they need different parts to work together, even if those parts weren't originally designed for the same machine. Frank looked at his granddaughter with amazement. And sometimes that makes them run better than they ever did before. Oh, exactly, Emma said with satisfaction. Vic smiled. I couldn't have explained it better myself. Frank sat back in his chair, aware that he was facing one of the most significant decisions of his life. Everything logical told him to be cautious, to consider the risks, to protect the stable life he'd built for Emma. But Emma herself seemed to see possibilities where he saw complications. If we did this, Frank said slowly, it would have to be on equal terms. Not you helping us, not us helping you, but genuine partnership. Agreed, Vic said immediately. And it would have to include Emma in every decision that affects her. She's not just along for the ride, she's part of this family. I wouldn't want it any other way, Vic replied. Frank looked at Emma. What do you think, kiddo? Are you ready for this kind of adventure? Emma's smile was bright enough to light up the coffee shop. I think it's going to be the best adventure ever. Frank extended his hand across the table to Vic. Partners. Partners, she confirmed, shaking his hand firmly. Emma insisted on shaking hands too, making their agreement official in her 7-year-old understanding of how important the deals were sealed. As they gathered their papers and prepared to leave the coffee shop, Frank realized that what had started as a legal strategy had evolved into something much more significant, a commitment to building a life together based on mutual respect, shared values, and the belief that families could be created by choice as well as by blood. So, Emma said as they walked toward their cars, when do we get the dog? Frank and Vic looked at each other and burst out laughing, both recognizing that their new partnership was going to be full of surprises they hadn't anticipated. We'll add it to the list, Vic said solemnly, right after we prove my innocence and figure out where we're all going to live. And before we paint my new room, Emma added helpfully. Frank shook his head, smiling. In the space of an hour, his carefully ordered life had been completely transformed. But as he watched Emma chattering excitedly with Vic about the possibilities ahead of them, he realized that sometimes the best changes were the ones you never saw coming. The Multnomah County Courthouse was the kind of building designed to intimidate all stone columns and marble floors that echoed with the weight of serious decisions. Frank adjusted his tie for the third time as Vic and Morrison climbed the steps toward the main entrance. Emma walked between them wearing her best dress and carrying a small notebook she'd insisted on bringing to take notes about justice. Remember, Morrison said quietly as they approached the security checkpoint, this is just a preliminary hearing. The judge will decide whether our evidence is admissible. If we can get past this stage, we'll have a real chance at trial. Frank nodded, though his stomach was tight with nervous energy. 3 weeks had passed since their coffee shop agreement, and the transformation had been remarkable. They'd formalized their business partnership, filed marriage papers that Morrison assured them provided maximum legal protection, and began the complex process of combining their lives. The practical arrangements had been surprisingly smooth. Vic had used her resources to purchase the garage building outright, ensuring their workshop would remain secure regardless of legal outcomes. They had found a house in the Irvington neighborhood close enough to the garage for daily commuting, large enough for all of them, with a yard that Emma had immediately identified as perfect for a dog. But the emotional adjustments had been more complex. Frank was still learning to share decision-making with someone whose business experience dwarfed his own. Vic was still learning to live with the noise and chaos of a 7-year-old's daily routine. Emma was still learning that having a new family member meant new rules and responsibilities alongside new opportunities. Frank and Vic said, as they moved through the metal detector, Are you ready for this? Frank looked at his wife. The words still felt strange, even though their arrangement was primarily legal and found strength in her calm confidence. As ready as I'll ever be. And if they ask questions I can't answer, then you say, I don't know, and let Morrison redirect. Frank replied, echoing the advice their lawyer had given them during preparation sessions. Truth is always the right answer, even when it's not the helpful answer. Emia tugged on Frank's sleeve. Grandpa, will I get to watch you testify? You'll be in the courtroom, Frank confirmed, but you'll need to be very quiet while the grown-ups are talking. I know, Emma said seriously. Mrs. Chen explained about court behavior. I'm supposed to sit still, listen carefully, and only speak if the judge asks me a direct question. Morrison looked surprised. Mrs. Chen explained court procedure to a 7-year-old. Mrs. Chen was a paralegal before she retired, Vic explained. She's been helping Emma understand what's happening today. They found seats in the gallery behind the defendant's table where Vic would sit with Morrison during the proceedings. Frank would remain in the witness area until called to testify, while Emma would stay with David Morrison's assistant Jennifer, who had experience managing children in legal settings. The courtroom filled slowly with lawyers, court personnel, and a few observers. Frank noticed a group of well-dressed individuals who appeared to be associated with Kellerman's legal team expensive suits. Serious expressions, the kind of coordinated presence that suggested significant resources. That's them, Vic said quietly, following Frank's gaze. Kellerman is the tall one in the navy suit. The woman beside him is Sandra Walsh, their lead attorney. Frank studied Richard Kellerman with interest. He'd expected someone obviously villainous, but Kellerman looked like any other successful businessman, confident, well-groomed, and completely at ease in the formal court environment. He doesn't look like a thief, Emma whispered. Bad people don't always look bad on the outside, Frank replied quietly. That's what makes them dangerous. Judge Patricia Coleman entered the courtroom with the measured pace of someone accustomed to controlling complex proceedings. She was perhaps 60 with gray hair and sharp eyes that suggested she'd heard every variation of legal argument over her years on the bench. All rise, the bailiff announced, the Honorable Judge Coleman presiding. Morrison rose first, followed by Vic. Frank noticed that his wife's posture had shifted into what he'd come to recognize as her professional mode, confident, focused, prepared for battle. Be seated, Judge Coleman said, settling behind the bench and reviewing the files before her. We're here for a preliminary hearing in the matter of Oregon versus Victoria Ashford. Counselors, are both parties ready to proceed? Ready for the defense, Your Honor, Morrison said. Ready for the prosecution, Your Honor, replied Sandra Walsh. Judge Coleman looked up from her files. Before we begin, I want to establish the scope of today's proceedings, Holmes. Ms. Walsh, the prosecution has filed a motion to exclude certain evidence recovered by the defense. Mr. Morrison, the defense has filed a counter motion to admit this evidence and to establish the credentials of your expert witness. We'll address these motions before considering any testimony. Frank felt his pulse quicken. The admissibility of their evidence would determine whether they had a case at all. Ms. Walsh, Judge Coleman continued, present your arguments for exclusion. Sandra Walsh rose with the fluid confidence of someone comfortable in courtrooms. Your Honor, the defense seeks to admit evidence that was recovered under questionable circumstances from a private warehouse. The defendant was subject to a restraining order that prohibited access to these materials, yet somehow these records were obtained after the order was filed. Frank felt Emma's small hand slip into his. She might not understand all the legal terminology, but she could sense the tension in the room. Furthermore, dear Stone, Walsh continued, the prosecution questions the reliability of testimony from Mr. Frank Sullivan, who has a personal relationship with the defendant that could compromise his objectivity. Mr. Sullivan is not a certified expert in archival systems or digital forensics, and his testimony appears designed to support evidence that may have been tampered with. Judge Coleman made notes as Walsh spoke. Mr. Morrison, your response. Morrison stood, and Frank noticed his lawyer's calm confidence. Your Honor, the evidence in question was recovered from a private warehouse owned by an independent trust, not by Ashford Industries. The restraining order does not apply to privately held assets that predate the current legal proceedings. Frank felt a small surge of hope. Additionally, Morrison continued, Mr. Sullivan's expertise is directly relevant to the archival system in question. He has 40 years of experience with mechanical systems of the type used for the evidence storage, including specific training on the analog computing systems that were standard in aerospace manufacturing during the relevant time period. Judge Coleman looked up from her notes. Mr. Morrison, what is the nature of Mr. Sullivan's relationship with the defendant? Mr. Sullivan and Mrs. Ashford are business partners in a technical consulting firm, Morrison replied. They're also married as of 2 weeks ago. Frank heard a murmur from the gallery and felt his face flush. He hadn't expected their marriage to be announced so directly. I see, Judge Coleman said dryly. Recent marriage to the defendant would seem to support Mrs. Walsh's concerns about objectivity. Morrison was prepared for this challenge. Your Honor, Mr. Sullivan's professional relationship with Mrs. Ashford predates any romantic involvement. His expertise in mechanical systems is independently verifiable and directly relevant to the evidence in question. The timing of their marriage, while recent, does not diminish his qualifications as an expert witness. Judge Coleman considered this. Ms. Walsh, do you have additional objections to Mr. Sullivan's testimony? We do, Your Honor, Walsh replied. We question whether Mr. Sullivan has any formal certification in archival systems or mechanical forensics. Morrison responded immediately. Your Honor, certification requirements for expert witnesses are based on relevant experience and demonstrated competence, not formal credentials. Mr. Sullivan's 40 years of experience with precision mechanical systems qualifies him to testify about the operation and reliability of the archival equipment. Frank watched the judge's face, trying to read her expression. Judge Coleman seemed to be weighing the competing arguments carefully. I'm going to hear Mr. Sullivan's testimony, Judge Coleman decided. I'll determine its reliability and relevance as we proceed. Ms. Walsh, you'll have full opportunity to cross-examine and challenge his qualifications. Frank felt Emma squeeze his hand with excitement, though she remained perfectly quiet, as Mrs. Chen had instructed. Mr. Sullivan, Judge Coleman said, please approach the witness stand. Frank stood on slightly unsteady legs, aware that everything they'd worked for in the past month depended on the next hour. As he was sworn in, he caught Vic's eye. She gave him a small nod of encouragement. Morrison approached the witness stand with a reassuring smile. Mr. Sullivan, please state your full name and occupation for the record. Frank William Sullivan. I'm a mechanical systems consultant and automotive repair specialist. Mr. Sullivan, please describe your educational and professional background. Frank took a deep breath and began the testimony they'd rehearsed. I served 8 years in the United States Air Force, specializing in aircraft maintenance and mechanical systems. After my military service, I worked for 20 years at Boeing, where I was responsible for maintaining and troubleshooting complex aircraft systems, including analog mechanical computing systems used in flight control and navigation. And after leaving Boeing, I've operated Sullivan's Auto, providing automotive repair and mechanical consulting services. I also work with vintage manufacturing equipment for private collectors and industrial historians. Morrison moved to a table where the recovered archive discs were displayed. Mr. Sullivan, have you examined the mechanical archival system in question? Yes, I have. Please describe this system for the court. Frank turned slightly toward the judge as Morrison had instructed. The archival system is a mechanical data storage device manufactured in the 1970s. It uses precision-encoded metal discs to store production and financial records. The system operates on purely mechanical principles, no electronic components that could be digitally altered or corrupted. In your professional opinion, could these records be tampered with or falsified? Not without leaving obvious physical evidence, Frank replied confidently. The encoding process creates permanent physical impressions in the metal. Any alteration would be immediately visible under proper examination. Morrison presented several of the recovered discs. Mr. Sullivan, have you examined these specific records? I have. Each disc contains date stamps, production signatures, and encoded financial data that correlates with the original manufacturing processes. And in your professional opinion, are these records authentic? Frank looked directly at Judge Coleman. Yes, Your Honor. These records show clear signs of authentic mechanical encoding from the original time period. There's no evidence of tampering or falsification. Morrison nodded. Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. No further questions. Sandra Walsh rose for cross-examination with the predatory grace of a skilled prosecutor. Mr. Sullivan, you testified that you were married to the defendant. When did this marriage occur? Frank had expected this question. 2 weeks ago. And when did you first meet Mrs. Ashford? Approximately 6 weeks ago. Walsh raised an eyebrow. So you married someone you'd known for only a month. Frank felt the courtroom's attention focus on him. Mrs. Ashford and I developed a professional relationship based on mutual respect and shared values. The timing of our marriage was influenced by practical considerations related to our business partnership. Practical considerations, legal protections for our joint business interests, and family arrangements. Walsh smiled coldly. Mr. Sullivan, isn't it true that you married the defendant specifically to provide favorable testimony in this case? Morrison started to object, but Frank answered before the objection could be heard. No, ma'am. I married Mrs. Ashford because I believe she's an honest person who's been falsely accused, and because we wanted to build a life together that would be good for my granddaughter. Frank heard a small sound from Emma and realized she was pleased with his answer. Walsh continued her attack. Mr. Sullivan, you have no formal training in forensic archival analysis, do you? No specific forensic training, Frank admitted. But I have 40 years of experience with the mechanical systems used in these archives. But you're not a certified expert witness, are you? I'm not certified by any particular organization, Frank replied. But I understand these systems better than most people working today. Walsh pressed forward. Mr. Sullivan, isn't it possible that someone with sufficient mechanical knowledge could alter these records without leaving obvious evidence? Frank considered the question carefully. It's theoretically possible, but it would require specialized equipment, extensive knowledge of the encoding process, and access to the original manufacturing tools. It would also be immediately detectable by anyone familiar with the system. But it is possible. Many things are theoretically possible, ma'am, but the evidence I've examined shows no signs of alteration. Walsh tried several more approaches, but Frank's answers remained consistent and confident. After 30 minutes of cross-examination, she returned to her table with obvious frustration. Judge Coleman looked at Frank with what might have been approval. Mr. Sullivan, thank you for your testimony. You may return to the gallery. As Frank walked back to his seat, and he caught Vic's eye again. This time her smile was filled with genuine warmth and gratitude. Judge Coleman reviewed her notes for several minutes before speaking. I've heard the arguments from both sides regarding the admissibility of evidence and the qualifications of the expert witness. While Mr. Sullivan's relationship with the defendant does raise questions about potential bias, his professional qualifications are sufficient to support his testimony about the mechanical archival system. Frank felt Emma grip his hand tightly. Therefore, Judge Coleman continued, I'm ruling that the recovered records are admissible as evidence subject to proper authentication. Mr. Sullivan's testimony about the mechanical integrity of the archival system provides sufficient foundation for the jury to consider these materials. The relief in the courtroom was palpable. Morrison's shoulders relaxed visibly, and Frank saw Vic close her eyes briefly in gratitude. But Judge Coleman wasn't finished. However, I'm also ruling that the prosecution may present additional expert testimony to challenge the reliability of these records. This case will proceed to full trial, where a jury will determine the weight and credibility of all evidence presented. As the hearing concluded and they gathered their materials, Frank realized that they'd won an important battle, but not the war. The real test would come at trial, where they'd have to convince 12 ordinary people that their mechanical records told a story of innocence in the face of determined opposition. How do you think we did? Emma asked as they walked down the courthouse steps. Frank looked at his granddaughter, then at Vic, then at the city of Portland, stretching out before them. I think we did our best, he said, and sometimes that's all you can do. But we're going to win, right? Emma asked with 7-year-old certainty. We're going to fight, Vic replied, and we're going to tell the truth. After that, we'll trust the system to work the way it's supposed to. As they drove home to the house they now shared, Frank reflected on how much their lives had changed in just 6 weeks. They'd gone from strangers to family, from individual struggles to shared purpose, from separate futures to a common destiny. Whatever happened at trial, Frank realized they'd already won something valuable. They'd created a partnership based on trust, respect, and the belief that good people could overcome difficult circumstances when they worked together. Emma fell asleep in the back seat, her head resting against the window. her notebook full of observations about justice and family and the way grown-ups fought for what they believed in. Frank looked at her peaceful face in the rearview mirror and felt a deep sense of satisfaction. They'd taught her something important today about standing up for truth and fighting for people you cared about. Whatever came next, that lesson would stay with her for the rest of her life. The jury deliberation lasted 3 days. 3 days of careful optimism, nervous pacing, and Emma asking approximately 200 questions about how 12 strangers could possibly agree on anything complicated. Frank spent the time working in the garage, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm of diagnosing problems and implementing solutions. Vic spent the time reviewing testimony transcripts and trying not to second-guess every decision they had made during the trial. Emma spent the time being 7 years old, which meant alternating between mature understanding of the situation's importance and complete absorption in whether the neighbor's cat would finally accept her friendship offerings. They'll reach a decision when they reach a decision, Frank told her on the morning of the third day, as they sat at the kitchen table of their Irvington house sharing breakfast and watching Portland wake up beyond their windows. But what if they don't believe us? Emma asked, stirring her cereal with the methodical precision she brought to everything that worried her. Then we'll deal with whatever comes next, Vic replied from her position at the counter where she was making coffee with the kind of careful attention that suggested she needed something to occupy her hands. But Em, I want you to know that no matter what the jury decides, your grandfather and I did the right thing. Emma considered this with the seriousness that had become her trademark. Mrs. Chen says doing the right thing is always correct, even when it's not successful. Frank smiled at his granddaughter's ability to distill complex philosophy into manageable concepts. Mrs. Chen is a wise woman. She also says the truth has a way of making itself known, Emma added, like flowers growing through concrete cracks. Vic looked at Emma with the expression of continued amazement that had become familiar over their weeks as a family. Where does Mrs. Chen come up with these things? She reads a lot of books about life, Emma explained. And she's very old, so she's seen lots of truth in concrete. The phone rang at 10:47 a.m., cutting through their morning routine with the sharp urgency of official business. Morrison's voice was carefully controlled when Frank answered. The jury has reached a verdict, Morrison said. Judge Coleman wants everyone in the courtroom at 2:00 p.m. Frank felt his stomach drop and soar simultaneously. Any sense of which way it went? No, Morrison replied. But Frank, whatever happens this afternoon, I want you to know that your testimony was crucial. The jury took this case seriously because you gave them a reason to believe the evidence was reliable. After hanging up, Frank found Vic and Emma in the living room, both looking at him with expectant faces. This afternoon, he said simply. Emma nodded as if she'd been expecting this news. Should I wear my good dress again? Yes, kiddo, Frank replied. This is definitely a good dress occasion. Vic moved to the window looking out at the street where normal life continued its routine of dog walkers and delivery trucks and neighbors heading to ordinary jobs. Frank, she said quietly, whatever happens today, I want you to know that these past few weeks have been the best part of my life in a very long time. Frank joined her at the window. Even with all the stress and uncertainty, especially with the stress and uncertainty, Vic replied, it showed me what we could accomplish together when we had something important to fight for. Emma appeared between them, taking both their hands. Are we going to be okay? No matter what. Frank and Vic looked down at her, then at each other. In 6 weeks, they'd built something that felt more solid than many relationships that had years to develop. We're going to be okay, Frank said with confidence he genuinely felt. We're a family now. That doesn't change because of what 12 strangers decide. The courtroom was more crowded for the verdict than it had been during testimony. Frank noticed faces he recognized from the aerospace community, people whose professional lives had been touched by Ashford Industries over the years. There were also reporters, though Morrison had assured them that media interest remained manageable. Richard Kellerman sat at the prosecution table with the same confident bearing he'd maintained throughout the trial. Frank studied his face, looking for signs of nervousness or guilt. But Kellerman appeared completely at ease. Judge Coleman entered with her usual measured pace, and the bailiff called the court to order. Frank felt Emma's hand find his as they stood for the judge's entrance. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Judge Coleman said after everyone was seated, have you reached a verdict? The jury foreman, A middle-aged man who'd worked in manufacturing his entire career stood with a folded piece of paper. "We have your honor. Please hand the verdict to the bailiff." Frank watched the paper make its journey from jury to bailiff, to judge, aware that his breathing had become shallow and careful. Beside him, Vic sat with perfect posture, but Frank could see the tension in her shoulders. Judge Coleman reviewed the verdict without expression, then handed it back to the bailiff. "Will the defendant please rise?" Vic stood with Morrison beside her. Frank had an almost overwhelming urge to stand with him, but he remained seated with Emma, squeezing her hand for reassurance that might have been as much for him as for her. "Members of the jury," Judge Coleman said, "please read your verdict." The foreman unfolded the paper and cleared his throat. "In the matter of Oregon versus Victoria Ashford on the charge of embezzlement in the first degree, we find the defendant not guilty." The words hit Frank like a physical force. Emma squeezed his hands so tightly he thought she might stop his circulation, but he barely noticed because Vic had turned toward them with an expression of relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. "Furthermore," the foreman continued, "the jury recommends that the district attorney's office investigate the financial activities of Richard Kellerman based on evidence presented during this trial." Frank heard a commotion from the prosecution table and saw Kellerman lean toward his attorney with obvious agitation. Sandra Walsh's face had gone pale. Judge Coleman thanked the jury for their service and dismissed them, then addressed the courtroom. "Mrs. Ashford, you are free to go. All charges against you are dismissed with prejudice. Mr. Morrison, please coordinate with the district attorney's office regarding the jury's recommendation for further investigation." As the judge left the bench, Frank and Emma rushed to Vic, who was still standing at the defendant's table with tears streaming down her face. "We won," Emma announced, as if there had been any doubt about the outcome. The truth grew through the concrete, just like Mrs. Chen said it would. Vic knelt down to Emma's level. "Yes, we did. And Emma, I couldn't have done this without you and your grandfather." "Does this mean the bad man will get in trouble now?" Emma asked. Frank looked toward the prosecution table where Kellerman was engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion with his legal team. "I think it means justice is going to work the way it's supposed to," Frank replied. Morrison approached their group with a smile broader than Frank had ever seen from the usually reserved attorney. "Ladies and gentlemen, you just witnessed what happens when good people refuse to give up in the face of injustice." "What happens next?" Vicky asked. "The district attorney will almost certainly pursue charges against Kellerman based on the evidence we presented," Morrison explained. "The jury's recommendation carries significant weight, and the case for embezzlement against him is actually stronger than the case they tried to build against you." Frank felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Not revenge exactly, but the knowledge that truth had prevailed and accountability would follow. As they left the courthouse, Frank noticed that Vic walked differently, with the confident stride of someone whose reputation had been restored and whose future was no longer defined by false accusations. "So what now?" Frank asked as they reached their cars. "What does the CEO of a vindicated woman do next?" Vic smiled, and Frank realized it was the first completely unguarded expression he'd seen from her since they'd met. The former CEO plans to focus on her new consulting business with her brilliant partner and his extraordinary granddaughter. Emma looked up sharply. "Does that mean you're not going back to the big company?" "It means I'm staying right here," Vic replied, "with you and your grandfather working on projects that matter to people we care about." "And we're still going to get away with them?" Emma asked, because 7-year-olds always knew which questions were most important. "We're definitely going to get a Tuya," Vic confirmed. "A family dog for our family business." As they drove home through Portland's familiar streets, Frank reflected on the transformation that had occurred over the past 2 months. What had started as a simple act of helping a stranger had evolved into something he couldn't have imagined: a new family, a new business partnership, and a new understanding of how much good people could accomplish when they chose to trust each other. "Grandpa Frank," Emma said from the back seat, "are you happy?" Frank looked at Vic, who was driving with the relaxed confidence of someone whose burdens had been lifted. He thought about their house with its yard and possibilities, about their garage, where they would continue building and fixing and creating solutions to interesting problems, about the future they would construct together. "Yeah, Em," he said, "I'm happy." "Me too," Emma announced, "and I think Mrs. Ashford is happy too." "Mrs. Ashford is very happy," Vic confirmed, "happier than she's been in a very long time." That evening, they celebrated with takeout Chinese food and Emma's favorite chocolate ice cream. Frank found himself watching Vic and Emma work together on a model airplane kit, Vic explaining the principles of lift and thrust, while Emma asked questions that revealed an intuitive understanding of engineering concepts. "She's going to be an extraordinary engineer someday," Vic said quietly when Emma went to brush her teeth. "She's going to be extraordinary at whatever she chooses," Frank replied. "But having you here to nurture her curiosity about science and technology, that's a gift I never could have given her on my own." Vic looked at him with the warmth that had replaced her initial guardedness. "Frank, I need you to understand something. When I suggested our marriage arrangement, I thought I was proposing a practical solution to a legal problem. I had no idea I was going to discover what it felt like to be part of a real family again." Frank reached for her hand. "Are you saying our marriage of convenience has become inconveniently real?" Vic laughed. "I'm saying our marriage of convenience has become the most convenient thing that ever happened to me." Later that night, after Emma had fallen asleep clutching her new model airplane, Frank and Vic sat on their front porch watching Portland settle into evening quiet. 6 months ago, Frank would never have imagined this scene, sitting with a brilliant, beautiful woman who had chosen to build a life with him and Emma, planning a future that felt full of possibilities rather than limitations. "Any regrets?" Vic asked. Frank considered the question seriously. "About standing up for what we believed in, about building this family, about taking risks for the right reasons." He shook his head. "No regrets at all. Even when I dragged you into a complicated legal battle that could have ended badly." "Especially then," Frank replied. Emma needed to see that her grandfather was the kind of man who fought for truth and justice. That lesson was worth any risk. Vic leaned against his shoulder with the comfortable familiarity that had developed between them. "I love you, Frank Sullivan," she said quietly. "Not because you saved me from legal troubles, but because you showed me what it means to live with integrity." Frank felt something settle in his chest, a sense of completeness he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. "I love you too, Victoria Ashford Sullivan," he replied, "and I'm grateful every day that your car broke down in the rain." As Portland's lights twinkled beyond their neighborhood, Frank realized that their story had become something larger than the sum of its parts. They'd proven that ordinary people could fight extraordinary battles when they had something worth fighting for. They demonstrated that families could be built on choice and commitment as much as biology. They'd shown them that the world still contained people who chose kindness over suspicion and truth over convenience. Most importantly, they discovered that second chances could lead to first loves, and that sometimes the best adventures began with the simple decision to help a stranger in need. 18 months later, the sign above the garage had been repainted twice since the trial, first to reflect their official business partnership, and then again when Emma declared that Sullivan Ashford Technical Services needed a logo. The result was a professional-looking shingle featuring Emma's surprisingly artistic rendering of a gear and an airplane symbols that somehow captured the essence of their work better than any corporate designer could have managed. Frank stood in the doorway of their expanded workshop, watching Vic explain hydraulic principles to a group of engineering students from Portland State University. What had started as occasional consulting work had evolved into something closer to a technical school, with young engineers coming to learn the hands-on skills that modern education often overlooked. "The key to understanding any hydraulic system," Vic was saying, her hands moving confidently over the demonstration equipment they'd built together, "is remembering that pressure seeks equilibrium. The system will always try to balance itself, and your job as an engineer is to understand how that balance works." Emma, now 8 and officially the Director of Quality Control for Sullivan Ashford Technical Services, moved between the students with the clipboard that had become her trademark accessory. She'd appointed herself responsible for ensuring that everyone understood the concepts before moving to the next lesson. "Excuse me," she said to one of the college students, a young man who looked barely older than some of her middle school classmates. "Could you explain back to me how the pressure differential works? Because Mrs. Ashford always says you don't really understand something until you can teach it to someone else." Frank smiled as he watched the student patiently explain hydraulic pressure to his 8-year-old supervisor. Emma's teaching philosophy, learned from watching Vic work with confused customers, had proven remarkably effective at ensuring that concepts were actually understood rather than simply memorized. The business had grown beyond anything Frank had imagined when they first shook hands in that coffee shop. Word had spread through the aerospace community that Sullivan Ashford could tackle problems that stumped larger consulting firms, complex mechanical systems that required both theoretical knowledge and practical experience to diagnose and repair. Their client list included major manufacturers, but also artists working on kinetic sculptures, inventors developing new mechanical systems, and museums trying to restore vintage equipment. Each project was different, challenging, and deeply satisfying in ways that Frank's previous work had never been. "Dad, you've got that proud grandfather look again," said a voice behind him. Frank turned to see David Morrison, no longer their attorney, but a friend who had become Emma's unofficial uncle, David approaching with 2 cups of coffee and his usual amused expression. "She's something special," Frank replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Both of them are." David followed Frank's gaze to where Vic was helping Emma demonstrate gear ratios using an antique transmission they'd restored the previous month. "You know, when I first met you three, I thought I was handling a straightforward legal case. I had no idea I was witnessing the formation of the most interesting family in Portland." Frank laughed. "Most interesting. Let's see," David counted on his fingers. "You've got a former Air Force mechanic, a former aerospace CEO, and an 8-year-old who can troubleshoot complex mechanical systems. Your family business includes everything from restoring vintage aircraft engines to consulting on space program components. And you're all three teaching university students skills they can't learn anywhere else in the Pacific Northwest." "When you put it that way, we do sound slightly unusual," Frank admitted. "Unusual and successful," David corrected. "NASA called again yesterday, by the way. They want Sullivan Ashford to consult on the mechanical backup systems for their new lunar lander project." Frank felt a familiar surge of excitement. The space program contract was exactly the kind of work he'd dreamed about during his Boeing years, challenging, important, and requiring the kind of hands-on expertise that he and Vic could provide together. "What did you tell them?" "I told them you'd get back to them after you discussed it with your partners," David replied. "All of your partners." Frank glanced toward Emma, who was currently explaining to a graduate student why his understanding of lever mechanics needed work. At 8, she was still too young to fully understand the implications of working with NASA, but she was old enough to have opinions about which projects were interesting and which were just regular, boring engineering. "She'll want to know if astronauts get to visit our workshop," Frank predicted. "I asked," David said with a grin. "They're tentatively planning a site visit if you take the contract." Frank imagined Emma's reaction to meeting actual astronauts and decided that particular conversation could wait until after dinner. The afternoon class session ended with the usual ritual: Vic assigning homework that would require students to apply what they'd learned to real-world problems, Emma distributing cookies that she'd baked with Mrs. Chen, and Frank answering questions about career paths that combined academic knowledge with practical skills. Professor Ashford called one of the students. They had all started using academic titles despite Vic's protests that she wasn't actually a professor. "Are you teaching the advanced hydraulics class next week?" "I am," Vic confirmed. "But remember, next week's class includes field work. We'll be diagnosing problems with actual equipment rather than working with demonstrations." Emma looked up from her cookie distribution. "It's going to be fun," she announced to the students. "Last time we did field work, we got to crawl inside a really big machine that makes paper. It was like being inside a giant mechanical puzzle." As the students gathered their materials and prepared to leave, Frank noticed the easy camaraderie that had developed between Vic and Emma. They'd evolved into a teaching team that complemented each other perfectly, Vic providing technical expertise and theoretical framework, Emma ensuring that explanations were clear and that no one was left behind. "How was your day?" Frank asked as the last student departed and they began cleaning up the workshop. "Excellent," Emma replied immediately. Tommy Richardson finally figured out gear ratios, and Sarah Martinez asked if she could come back next weekend to work on her project. "I think she's going to be a really good engineer someday." Vic smiled at Emma's assessment. "What about you, Em? What did you learn today?" Emma considered the question with the seriousness she brought to self-evaluation. "I learned that explaining things to other people helps me understand them better. And I learned that college students ask really good questions when they're not afraid of looking stupid." Frank exchanged a look with Vic. Emma's insights about teaching and learning often surprised them with their sophistication. Speaking of learning, Vic said, I had an interesting conversation with your teacher, Mrs. Patterson, this afternoon. Emma looked up with the wariness that 8-year-olds developed when adults discuss them with other adults. What kind of conversation? The kind where she told me you've been helping other students with their science projects, Vic replied. Apparently, you've become quite the problem-solving consultant for third-grade engineering challenges. Emma's face brightened. Jeremy Williams was having trouble with his volcano, and I showed him how to make the eruption more realistic using better pressure calculations. And Lisa Chen, that's Mrs. Chen's granddaughter, needed help with their bridge project, so I explained about weight distribution and structural integrity. Frank shook his head in amazement. Em, you realize you're applying advanced engineering concepts to elementary school projects. I'm just helping my friends solve problems, Emma replied matter-of-factly. That's what engineers do, right? As they walked home together, the house was only 3 blocks from the garage, making their commute a pleasant family ritual. Frank reflected on how their daily routines had evolved into something that felt both comfortable and exciting. Emma skipped ahead, pointing out interesting cloud formations and speculating about the aerodynamics of the birds flying overhead. Vic walked beside Frank, occasionally calling out responses to Emma's observations while discussing their plans for the evening. Morrison called this morning, Vic said as they turned onto their street. The final appeals in Kellerman's case were denied. He's looking at a minimum of 8 years in federal prison. Frank nodded with satisfaction. Richard Kellerman's trial had been swift and decisive once investigators began following the financial evidence Frank and Vic had uncovered. The embezzlement had been even more extensive than originally suspected, affecting not just Ashford Industries, but several other companies where Kellerman had served on boards of directors. Any word on Ashford Industries itself, Frank asked. The new management team is doing well, Vic replied. They have offered me a consulting position 3 times, but I keep declining. I like what we've built here better than anything I ever had in corporate management. Frank understood the sentiment completely. Sullivan Ashford Technical Services provided the intellectual challenges and meaningful work that corporate positions offered, but with the added satisfaction of building something together as a family. Their house came into view, a craftsman-style home with a front porch that had become Emma's preferred location for homework and Vic's favorite spot for morning coffee. The yard showed signs of 8-year-old enthusiasm, a tire swing that Frank had installed on the old oak tree, a vegetable garden that Emma maintained with scientific precision, and a doghouse that currently housed Gears, the golden retriever puppy they'd adopted 6 months earlier. Gears, Emma called as they approached the front gate. The puppy bounded toward them with the unrestrained enthusiasm that only young dogs could manage, tail wagging so vigorously that his entire body wiggled with excitement. Frank watched Emma drop to her knees to receive Gears' greeting, laughing, as the puppy attempted to lick every inch of her face. The sound of his granddaughter's laughter still filled him with the kind of deep contentment that made every challenge they'd faced worthwhile. Frank, Vic said quietly as they watched Emma and Gears play in the front yard, do you ever think about how different our lives would be if my car hadn't broken down that day? Frank considered the question seriously. Sometimes, he admitted, but then I remember that good things tend to find each other. If it hadn't been the broken radiator hose, it would have been something else. You think we were destined to meet? I think people who are willing to help strangers in the rain tend to recognize each other, Frank replied. And I think Emma would have found a way to bring us together regardless, because she has a talent for identifying good people. That evening, they followed their established routine. Emma practiced piano while Vic prepared dinner, and Frank worked on maintenance projects around the house. The domestic rhythm they'd developed felt natural, as if they'd been a family for years rather than months. Dinner conversation covered Emma's science fair project, a working model of a hydraulic lift, Vic's plans for expanding their consulting services, potentially adding a material science component, and Frank's proposal for restoring a vintage aircraft engine, a project that would combine all their skills. Can I help with the airplane engine? Emma asked. I promise I'll be careful with the precision instruments. You'll be more than help, Vic assured her. You'll be essential. Aircraft engines require exactly the kind of systematic thinking you're best at. Emma beamed with pride. I love being essential. After dinner, they moved to the living room where Vic read aloud from a book about the history of aviation, while Emma worked on a mechanical puzzle Frank had designed for her. Gears sprawled across Frank's feet, occasionally lifting his head to ensure that his family was all accounted for. Grandpa Frank, Emma said during a pause in the reading, are you happy we became a family? The question caught Frank slightly off guard, though Emma's direct approach to important topics no longer surprised him. Happier than I ever imagined possible, he replied honestly. Even though it was complicated and scary sometimes, especially because it was complicated and scary, Frank said. The best things in life usually require some courage. Emma nodded thoughtfully. Mrs. Chen says courage isn't about not being scared. It's about doing the right thing even when you are scared. Vic closed the book and looked at Emma with the expression of continued wonder that had become familiar. Emma, you're going to be an extraordinary woman someday. I'm going to be an extraordinary woman who's also an engineer, Emma corrected. And I'm going to build things that help people solve important problems. Just like your parents. Frank observed the words slipping out naturally. Emma looked up sharply. Did you just call Mrs. Ashford my mom? Frank felt a moment of panic, wondering if he'd overstepped boundaries they'd never clearly defined. But Vic's smile was warm and encouraging. Well, Vic said carefully, I've been thinking of you as my daughter for months now, if that's okay with you. Emma considered this with typical seriousness. Would that make you officially my mom and Grandpa Frank officially my dad? Technically, he'd still be your grandfather, Vic explained, but he'd also be your adoptive father. It's a little complicated, but families often are. I like complicated, Emma announced. Complicated means more interesting. And I think I'd like having both a grandpa and a dad who are the same person and a mom who teaches me about engineering. Frank felt his throat tighten with emotion. The family they'd built through choice and commitment had become something deeper than legal arrangements or practical partnerships. They'd become what Emma had always deserved, a home where she was loved, valued, and encouraged to become whoever she wanted to be. Later that night, after Emma had fallen asleep with Gears curled up at the foot of her bed, Frank and Vic sat on their front porch, watching Portland settle into evening quiet. Any regrets? Vic asked the same question she'd posed 18 months earlier. Frank looked at the house where their daughter was sleeping peacefully, thought about the business they'd built together, considered the future that stretched ahead of them, full of possibilities and shared dreams. Just one, he said finally. Vic looked surprised. What? Frank smiled. I regret that it took us 60-plus years to find each other. Think of all the interesting problems we could have solved together if we'd met when we were younger. Vic laughed. Frank Sullivan, you're forgetting something important. What's that? If we'd met when we were younger, we wouldn't have been the people we needed to be for each other, and we never would have had Emma. Frank considered this wisdom and realized she was absolutely right. Their story had unfolded exactly as it needed to, bringing them together at the moment when they were ready to build something meaningful with the experiences and values they'd accumulated over lifetimes of work loss and learning. Besides, Vic continued, reaching for his hand, I happen to think our timing was perfect. We've got years ahead of us to solve interesting problems together, and we've got the best quality control supervisor in the business to keep us honest. Frank squeezed her hand, thinking about NASA contracts and aviation engines, and the 8-year-old girl who would grow up knowing that families were built on love and choice, that good people still fought for truth and justice, and that the most extraordinary adventures often began with the simple decision to help a stranger in need. Perfect timing, he agreed, for the perfect family. As Portland's lights twinkled beyond their neighborhood and Gears barked softly in his sleep, Frank realized that their story had become exactly what he'd always hoped for, but never dared to expect, a testament to the power of kindness, the strength of chosen families, and the truth that sometimes the most beautiful destinations were the ones you never knew you were looking for. The mechanic's heart, it turned out, had been perfectly calibrated for love all along. Frank Sullivan's journey reminds us of something our generation has always known, but sometimes forgets in today's complicated world, that the measure of a man isn't found in his bank account or his job title, but in his willingness to do what's right when nobody's watching. At 62, Frank thought his life was set raise. Emma, keep the garage running, make it through each day with dignity intact. Sound familiar? Many of us have been there, carrying responsibilities we never asked for but accepted, because that's what men do. We step up. We provide. We protect what matters most. But Frank's story teaches us that life isn't finished with us just because we've reached a certain age. Sometimes our greatest adventures, our deepest loves, and our most important contributions come when we least expect them. When Frank stopped to help a stranger in the rain, he wasn't trying to change his life. He was simply being the man his values taught him to be. That's the real lesson here, isn't it? That integrity isn't about grand gestures or perfect outcomes. It's about small choices made consistently that define who we are. It's about showing up for family even when it's hard. It's about helping people who need it even when there's nothing in it for us. It's about fighting for truth even when the odds seem impossible. Frank discovered that love doesn't have an expiration date, that families can be built through choice as much as blood, and that experience and wisdom are gifts we can share with younger generations, hungry to learn what we've spent decades figuring out. His partnership with Victoria and his role as Emma's grandfather show us that our best years might still be ahead of us. Years filled with purpose, connection, and the satisfaction that comes from building something meaningful with people who truly matter. If Frank's story resonates with you, you'll want to check out our video about The Carpenter's Promise, another tale of a man who discovers that life's second chapter can be its most rewarding. And don't miss When Grandfathers Lead stories that celebrate the wisdom and strength that come with experience. Hit that subscribe button if you believe the world needs more stories about good men making tough choices for the right reasons. Share this with someone who understands that real strength comes from character, not circumstances. Because in a world that often celebrates the loud and flashy, we choose to honor the quiet heroes, the mechanics and grandfathers, and decent men who hold everything together with calloused hands and generous hearts. Until next time, remember, your values are your legacy, and your kindness can change someone's entire world.